can feel my body cold against the concrete, but I can't seem to get enough. My mind is fixed on what it wants. I just let you beat me, look at me deceiving. Let you get the best of me, in bed with my worst enemy. This is a no-go, I just can't take hold. This is a danger zone, back up and get me home. This is a no-go, I just can't take hold. This is a danger zone, back up and get me. So put your hand in mine, follow me, let me waste your time. Set up me, do some stupid shit. Take a seat, let me waste your time. So put your
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Lawyers Den on the Pod TV Network. I'm Nick Pellavita. I will be one of the speakers for today's show, which is we're going to discuss a very important case that just came out west in the great state of California. And this was a federal judge who determined that President Trump was illegally calling out the National Guard to the state of California, citing the 10th Amendment, which, of course, we all know gives the states the ability to determine rights that the federal government doesn't assert. But very interesting also, he went on further to stay the order till Friday, which is actually a couple of days from now, and see if the Ninth Circuit will pick it up. Since the Ninth Circuit has picked it up, so it's going to go on to the appellate court. But it creates a very interesting conflict as to who controls the National Guard in the United States of America. Is it controlled by the states or is it controlled by the federal government? And we're going to bring in one of our attorneys, Mr. Peter Bennett, to see if he's done any review or your homework on this. But Peter, I picked this one up because it seemed to be a very fascinating case for our listeners. In other words, it deals with the National Guard. And as we all know, there's riots taking place in the California area, and they filed a suit, and the judge was actually appointed by President Reagan. He was saying, no, you can't do this, Mr. Trump. You're operating illegally. Of course, when I hear that, the progressives just throw this in my ear. He did something illegal. So what are your thoughts about this? Peter, I would be very curious to see your thoughts relating to the National Guard and the ability for the state to control it, or is it controlled by the executive branch?
This is, at first glance, I figured, the National Guard, of course, in a situation that's considered urgent, the president would definitely have power. But this is a very complex issue. But before we get into the ultimate legal argument, I always save that towards a little further back in Lawyers Den, which isn't that long anyway. And by the way, we will be off for Lawyers Den and Wall Street Hackers, which follows Lawyers Den next week. So we'll be back July 1st at 6 and 6:15 roughly p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So we'll be off next week. Nick has to travel. So here's the background on this issue, which again is not as clear legally as one would have thought. The Ninth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals on Thursday temporarily blocked a federal judge's order that directed President Trump to return control of the National Guard troops to California after he deployed them following protests in Los Angeles over the raids. Everybody knows about those for sure. The court said it would be holding a hearing on that today, June 17th. So there may be news on that. I haven't checked on that, but it's probably not out yet. And it could be going on very likely also. So we don't have an answer on their ruling, but so far we have a stay. Before that, the U.S. District Judge, as Nick just mentioned, ruled the Guard deployment was illegal and both violated the 10th Amendment and exceeded Trump's statutory authority. So there were two arguments he basically used. And interestingly, too, the order only applied to the National Guard troops and not Marines. I believe the judge, and we'll get into that when we get into the legalities, intentionally didn't get into the Marines. That's a more complicated argument, even if you believe President Trump didn't have that power. So California attorney argued that Trump abused his authority by invoking a provision of Title 10 that allows the president to mobilize the National Guard if there's an invasion or a rebellion underway. And he said, and also he argued that President Trump's order federalized National Guards over the objections of the governor and local law enforcement. And he argued that was counterproductive, and there is an argument to be said that that is not allowed. So the administration argued courts did not interfere when President Eisenhower deployed the military about school desegregation to protect school desegregation. And that is a fact. And the courts did not interfere when President Nixon deployed the military to deliver the mail in the midst of a postal strike. And the court should not interfere here too. So there is some precedent on one side to say the courts have not interfered and this has been done before. So they also took the position that this is not subject to judicial review, which is another whole discussion. But there are now have been since just President Trump's taking office, there have been 170 lawsuits against him and 40 injunctions, and that's probably going to be limited by the Supreme Court in the future because there are about 700 district judges making all rulings. And it's been decades that people have complained about district judge, both liberals and conservatives have complained, but that's another whole discussion. So Breyer said that what's happening in LA is not meeting the definition of a rebellion. That was his conclusion. And the White House called Breyer's, he's the lower court judge, orders unprecedented. He says, he has no authority to usurp the president's authority as commander-in-chief. So those are the background. I'll bring Nick in because I was like to save the next round of more in-depth legal arguments. What do you think so far, Nick?
Well, I mean, the thing is, it's quite interesting because I was a little shocked but Justice Breyer, as we all know, I believe he's related to the Breyer that sat on the Supreme Court.
I was wondering that.
Who turned out to be a very liberal justice. But I was kind of shocked by the decision because the National Guard seems to imply that is an executive function.
Yeah, national isn't the word.
You see what I mean? It's not the state guard, it's a National Guard. And for what I remember in the history of desegregation, that the President Eisenhower did call out the National Guard in the great state of Alabama to Montgomery. And so now all of a sudden that this president doesn't have the right to call out the National Guard I had seemed to have little problems with that, Peter. I was going, I couldn't believe that they made this decision. It seems to me that we have a history that they can, not that they can't. Right. But the good news, if there is any, the federal judge did decide to defer and stay it and move it up the food chain, which the circuit court has taken jurisdiction over. So it'll be stayed until we listen to what an appellate court said. And we're going to follow this on Lawyer's Den because this may move up the food chain all the way to the Supreme Court.
Right.
Remember we have the International Court of Trade, which we're very fortunate on this show to have Jeffrey Schwab, who actually did the oral arguments on that case, and he won that case. I know he debated you, and I thought you beat him quite badly in the debate on Lawyer's Den. But sometimes, as you know, when you get beat up in an argument, you go back and refine your arguments, which it seems like
you had said that, Nick.
And he came back and he won the case. So
yeah, but that was in the lower court, right?
Yeah, in the lower court.
Yeah, where he had forum shop to begin with. So
yeah, he
probably could have just said, I don't like President Trump.
It's possible. It's possible, but it's being moved up I call it moved up the food chain into the higher courts, which we will follow that on the Lawyer's Den and of course all of our listeners, because this is better than NFL football. I'm sorry. There's a lot of stuff going on here.
Some of our viewers would disagree, but
if you want to follow a good game, follow the International Court where the tariffs were struck down, but that's being moved up the food chain.
It is a contact sport. I'll give you that.
and this is a big game. Who controls the National Guard? Remember, when you're having issues in California, and states have a history of this, especially certain states, which they have allowed certain individuals to run roughshod over businesses, and these businesses are sitting going, where are the police? The police don't show up. Where are the state troopers? They don't show up, and their businesses burned to the ground.
Right.
So
As
now,
has happened in LA, there's been, I mean, there's,
I know. I
again,
mean, the
this
thing
is
is,
the legal argument, but the moral argument is, whether or not he has the right to do this. I mean, you've got people throwing rocks. One guy threw a Molotov cocktail.
I know, right. Well, as you well know, in Florida, there is a policy that this will not happen. And when I in Florida, you can rest assured it did not happen. Because of the business owners were not very happy watching their establishments burn down.
Well,
so
I can
National Guard stopping
in Florida, Governor DeSantis would call out the National Guard, and not unlike Newsom, who resisted calling out the National Guard, would cooperate. Sure. So, and that's another whole discussion on politics, which we won't get into here.
Well, as our viewers can see, all the attorneys who are watching this, there's a melding between political and legal stances. And what we try to do at the Lawyer's Den is obviously look at the legal aspects of this. And that's what the courts are going to do. They're going to look at what does the law say, and then they do use precedent. So they look at what other prior situations have taken place, and then they render their decisions from there. And you said there's like 170 of them. So we have a lot of material to go over, Peter. But this one I thought was an exciting one.
We won't get material during this administration, but let me get into legal arguments now, because we are running out of time. We only run about 15 minutes.
Right.
And you're right, by the way, as an aside. But a lot of those 170, if the Supreme Court limits to the lower courts to say you actually have to have jurisdiction, you can't make national decisions, which is, again, another whole discussion. But liberals for years have complained when conservative justices did this. Sotomayor complained about that. When a Texas court several years ago ruled that restricting an abortion drug, she said, this is outrageous. You can't do this. Now she may rule the other way, in terms of jurisdiction, but the court's overwhelmed. But here's the final line. And this is where it gets complicated. The two basic arguments in one, the first, I don't buy at all. The judge accepted the argument that this is not a, quote, rebellion or whatever you want to call it, but I think it's not up to the courts to decide what's a rebellion. Plus, there's a fair amount of evidence that it is a rebellion. It's a rebellion against the authority of the government to enforce immigration laws. So I don't think they have a chance in the Supreme Court on that issue. But here's the other issue, though, that really is complicated and might come down to the interpretation of Title X, which is the statute that was invoked by the administration when they did it. And I pulled up the original source, because that's always the best place to look when you're looking, especially at statutes. You look at the original source. In finance, by the way, like on Wall Street Hackers, I would say, look at the original source, go to the company, look at the financials, things like that. So here's what it says, and it's really complicated because the way it's written, I won't read every word because it's complicated, but it basically says that the president and the Secretary of Defense has the right to call it up. But then in one part, section F, it says the consent of a governor described in subsection B and D may be withheld. So it gives them the right to withhold it with regard to active duty cannot be withheld with regard to active duty outside the United States, its territories and its possessions. So they're saying the governor in section B and D cannot withhold it, but they're not saying anything about the United States inside. So the implication is under section B and D, he can do it. This is very technical. But the other argument is there is a section A, so which might apply in the United States, and that's what I would be arguing if I want to argue that it should apply. So the first part, though, however, says in times of war or national emergency declared by Congress, the National Guard can be called up. But the Congress has not done that. By the way, as a footnote, Congress could possibly agree with their administration, but that wouldn't be a 50-50 vote, and the Democrats wouldn't probably go along with it. So that doesn't apply. But then there's one last word. This is the problem with statute writing when you write such long statutes. Then it says, though, that however, a member of an inactive status list can be called up if approved by the Secretary of Defense, if he determines that there are not enough qualified reserves in an active status or in an inactive National Guard in the required category who are readily available. Now, if you could argue, well, the part that says the governor can decline doesn't apply to A, so then it's a question of, the interpretation of that, but it does give you a separate little section that might allow it. So this is not simple law. I wouldn't promise. Some of the other issues we've dealt with are a little more crystal clear or clear, but this one will be heading to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, that's what I would say. And as it heads to the Supreme Court, we're going to be heading off the air because we're past our time. But we want to thank Peter Bennett and the Lawyers Den team for bringing up this very important issue.
July 1st, remember.
And yes, and we will follow it later. We'll see you next time on Lawyers Den.
I can feel my body hold against the concrete, but I can't seem to get enough. My mind is fixed on what it wants. I just let you beat me. Looks can be deceiving. Let you get the best of me. I'm bad with my worst enemy. This is a no-go. I just can't take hold. This is a danger zone. Back up and get me home. This is a no-go. I just can't take hold. This is a danger zone. Back up and get me. So put your hand in mine. Follow me. Let me waste your...
Okay, we're going to be moving on just shortly into Wall Street Hackers. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Wall Street Hackers on the Pod TV network. And today we're going to be discussing what's been happening on Wall Street. And we have our speaker today, who's the hacker himself, a graduate of UCLA, where he received his degree in economics, also an MBA from New York University, and a law degree from the University of Miami, spending 17 years in the New York City area studying the stock market copiously and looking for the little nuances and I guess they call them Easter eggs that you can find. We're bringing none other than Peter Bennett to share with us what is going on in the stock market. So Peter, welcome to your show, and let us know where we are, where we're from, what we're going to do with this market.
And you're right. There is a lot happening in the stock market because there's a lot happening in the news. There's always a lot happening in the news in the stock market, but this is really a time of interest and uncertainty, to say the least. So welcome to Wall Street Hackers, June 17th, 2025. We will be off next week and then resume July 1st. Lawyers Den is 6 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And then we have Wall Street Hackers roughly 6:15 Eastern Standard Time PM. So sometimes I kind of borrow quotes of the week to say my story. Obviously, I'm picking them because I believe in them, but these are very insightful quotes, I believe. So this is first from JP Morgan Wealth Management in their mid-year outlook. Our global investment strategy group sees the global economy losing some steam in the short run as recession risks have picked up. In the long run, they believe the economy will weather the headwinds and absorb higher tariffs thanks to, in part, to growth-friendly policies. That is exactly what I've been saying on Wall Street Hackers. And again, I picked it because I like it, because I agree with it. But in the short run, tariffs are going to hurt. But in the long run, it will help. So there are headwinds there for the market. And there are other headwinds, too, because of everything going on, not to mention the Middle East. So the market is ignoring a lot. And you always wonder why. Is it that people have learned over the years, always never sell, buy the dips, that kind of strategy, which worked for decades because the market was going up so quickly. But right now, the market is at near historic valuations, and there are major, major issues. The government of the U.S. and the world in gigantic debt and with unfunded liabilities for healthcare. And in a time of change, there's so many different things that say maybe the market isn't as safe as it once was. But the market keeps ignoring things. The S&P right now, the good news and the bad news kind of thing is the S&P and NASDAQ are very close to their all-time highs. The bad news is that if you look at a chart, pull up the S&P or the QQQs, and year to date, it's basically flat. It's almost perfectly flat for the last 6 months, roughly. And also, if you took a 1-year look, it's flat again. So there's been no progress. If you had your money in the market on average in the S&P 500 or the QQQ, you've made no money. You haven't kept up with inflation. And that's been a long-term fear with pressures from higher interest rates and likely stagflation, not certain stagflation, but certainly inflation and all these changes. So my fear is that the market will remain flat possibly for years. And it reminds me of a different show that I used to be on many years ago. And one of the commentators would say, just buy the S&P and just keep investing and investing and investing. You always win. I said, well, what if the market's flat for 10 or 20 years? There have been some times that are down. Now, I'm not saying be out of the market. I'm just saying very selected investments, I believe the ones that I talk about more, and bonds aren't a bad idea as a ballast, certainly. And, getting almost 5% in a long-term bond may be a good strategy too. So, but we're not in that section yet. So another risk, which Barron's came up with just this last weekend, the headline was Google search is fading. The whole internet could go with it. What they were talking about is AI taking over search. And the numbers in that article are staggering. Large parts of, not gigantic, but maybe 17%, I believe it was, of Google's travel of internet search has been replaced by AI. And I was surprised by this, but a lot of people are using AI instead of the internet because they're saying, find me the best, airplane flight to this place. And AI is probably just going to improve, and people are relying on it more. So that takes away and could affect Google. It could affect other of the Magnificent Seven. And that has been what has supported the market for the last few years. And it's also been what grew the market before the last year for several years. So it's a time of change, and you have to be very careful about your investments, as always, but especially now. The second quote was, selected quotes are from the New York Fed, and this came on 6/10/25. They said, the New York Fed conducted a survey of businesses and found most businesses passed on at least some of the higher tariffs to their customers through higher prices. It found that about 90% of manufacturers and roughly 3/4 of service firms that import some goods, and among those firms, almost 1/3 of manufacturers and about 45% of the service firms reported fully passing along the costs. 45% of manufacturers and 1/3 of service firms said they passed on some of the costs. So you're talking about, bottom line, substantial amounts of manufacturing and service where they're saying, I need to pass on some or all of the costs. And if they don't pass on the cost, they may have to pay to bring manufacturing back here, and that will cost the businesses. So even if the bottom line on tariffs is a few bottom lines. One, I think tariffs are absolutely important to the United States to level the playing field. It's been unfair, and we have huge deficits, and why should other countries take advantage of us? Two, I believe the market is, I think we're going to settle in at mostly 10% tariffs for a lot of countries, some 20, 25, some higher, but that will do some damage to the economy. It'll be a headwind. It won't be, in the long run, destructive. In the end, it will help the United States because it'll help us with our deficits, and maybe they can lower taxes more because of that down the road. So I'm optimistic in the long run, but I'm I think you have to be careful in the short run because it's a volatile time. And the final thing I'll say there about the market is, again, the market's almost like ignores the news. So this one, I could see with them ignoring to a point, but if the Middle East blows up now in terms of Iran decides to close the Straits of Hormuz, which they're saying 20, small chance, but so maybe that's why the market can't ignore this, but they can't ignore debts and deficits. The United States, 37 trillion almost in debt, or 125 trillion, which is what I argue, counting Medicare and Social Security. You can't ignore that, and you can't ignore that tariffs are going to do some damage. But if it breaks out and the Straits of Hormuz are closed, that's 20% of global oil, which could also do some damage, to inflation and cause more stagflation. So you have to be careful, and investment selection may be extremely critical during this period. Moving on, most interesting story of the week. So there were so many interesting stories. One, we'll talk about later, the debate, let's call it, or argument between Elon Musk and President Trump. That will be the panel discussion coming up in just a few minutes. But the one I picked, and of course, everybody's seeing all over everything about the Middle East, so we don't need that, to be covered. But the one I picked was one that was reasonably covered, but in different ways, and that was what was, to me, the most interesting. So what we're talking about is Senator Alex Padilla, and it highlights, one, the difference in reporting, but also what I talked about last week, which is how the Democrats and the media keep slanting the truth to a point where they're going to get caught by anybody who's paying attention. And it's not good for anyone. It's not good for the country. It's not good for the media. It's not good for them. So the truth will set you free. Here's the background. And this is straightforward, objective. You can't argue about any of this because it's all there. California Senator Alex Padilla was thrown out of a Los Angeles news briefing at Homeland Security Kristi Noem's meeting where they discussed customs enforcement riots that have engulfed LA. He was actually thrown to the ground and handcuffed. So here's the take of MSNBC, which is always psychotic, and many in the mainstream media who brought on Democrats and never gave counter arguments or counterfacts. So here's what they said to the public. This is what the story they told. They said, all he did was ask a question. He said, and he did say this, I'm Senator Alex Padilla. I have questions for the secretary, because the fact of the matter is that half a dozen of criminals that you're rotating on but then he was stopped because the security people stopped him from talking. So he was just, quote, he only asked a question. Padilla was then cut off and yelled, hands off, several times before being finally pushed out of the room as the briefing continued. So many Democrats I saw on and these are some of the ones, at least some of them, who were known to have told fibs, let's say, before. This is one of the most outrageous things I've ever seen in my life. This is absolute authoritism at its worst. On and on and on, at least quite a number. And the media just went with this. What they forgot to mention is the following kind of important facts. One, Padilla did ask the question, but he yelled out the question in the middle of Noem's speech and in the middle of Noem's sentence. She was just talking, and it wasn't the time for questions and answers at all. Number two, they forgot to mention that he was moving towards the podium fairly forcibly. He was moving. Nobody else in the room was moving towards the podium. He's moving towards the podium as he's talking, getting ready to talk. And the security people are going, what are you doing? Who are you? He was not wearing a senator pin, which might have helped. I don't know if that was intentional or not, or if he just wanted to create a scene. But then as he was moving forward, he was pushing fairly forcibly, and the security people started pushing him back. And they pushed him back. And he never said, he never really, he was impolite, bottom line. And in the middle of a meeting, it's like, I want to ask a question now. I'm going towards you. I'm going to walk up to you. And initially, they didn't even know who he was. So these are kind of important facts that were left out. And the final thing that I didn't hear on any mainstream media was Kristi Noem was happy to meet with him later when she knew who he was and when it was appropriate. And she actually spent 15 minutes with him after this meeting, even with his behavior, and talked to him about the issue. So it's, kind of like the other politician who showed up at an immigration center and just tried to barge through the fence and say, I'm a congressperson, I can do whatever I want. It's like, no, but the main point is about how the media slanted things again. And this is not good. People might think, oh, you're, conservative or Republican. I don't consider myself that at all. I think I'm, it depends on the issue. But the bottom line is that this is bad for the Democratic Party, too. Even if you're a Democrat, you're going, why don't these people at least start telling the truth and making intelligent arguments? And why does the media stop just buying everything? Because this is a bad cycle for the country, and it's just dividing the country because there's two sets of facts. Next segment. Why President Trump should give me a call. Someday, maybe I'll actually get a call from the White House. So we've covered lots of topics already, and I think they're very significant. I suggested many times already, you should tell Putin that we're going to increase the military aid to Ukraine 10 to 15% a month every 2 months forever until we get a ceasefire. And, that was like 6-8, I like that, call me. So that was like 8 weeks ago and no progress at all. That might break the deadlock. I've also explained how EVs are terrible for the environment, not only because it takes 500,000 pounds of minerals to make one battery, but also and that's bad enough, but they burn a lot of rubber because they weigh 10% more. So they burn tires and brakes. And, you combine those two studies, which I don't think anybody does. So again, another idea that, and this one, I have to say, I'm not 100% sure on, but this is something that I thought should have been done. And I heard somebody saying, maybe we should do it now. But so right now, the U.S. is in a very difficult political situation. And President Trump has some very difficult decisions because Israel cannot deliver just total destruction to the Iran's mountain fortress, where they have their deep buried nuclear site. They've been able to destroy, I guess, the rest of it or a lot of it, but they can't get in there without a bunker busting bomb. So somebody even on the radio today, just right before I was preparing the show, said maybe we should give it to him. Well, maybe we should have given it to him before. And this is an idea. I don't know what the negative would have been. And, I'll admit, maybe there's some factors I don't know. But if we had given them the equipment before the war or maybe years ago, we wouldn't be in this dilemma, because then we could say, well, look, you've got the weapon, you do it. We don't have to get involved. And then there wouldn't be as many possible repercussions for the United States getting involved, because we wouldn't be involved. We've sold a lot of military equipment and given military equipment to other allies in the world. And so we could have prepared for this in advance. And, again, this one I'm not sure of, but plenty of ideas I have. Back to pure finance, dividend pick of the week. So disclaimer, Wall Street's hackers is for entertainment only. Consult your financial advisor. There are no guarantees on any suggestions. And anybody who says they guarantee anything is not promising anything, because a CD and a treasury are only guaranteed. And those are only guaranteed if you hold them to maturity. These are only our opinions. So this week I had to go back to MPLX one more time at least, because it's far my largest equity allocation. And my concern is it's starting to rise again. And I'm afraid that the buying opportunities won't be as high if it gets to where I believe it should be valued. So I was going to get into something which I'll discuss on April 1st, which is a very small short position using options in Apple, which I'm not very bullish on at all. And I think at least it should say neutral, and even if it say neutral, I'll be a winner on this position. But I think they've got some issues, especially now with more competition and a lot of other issues. But that's not what we're talking about. So MPLX, though, I always wish I could find one stock. This has been one stock I love for years. And there's so much I'm going to get into in a minute about why I like it, but I can't find anything else to rival it. So I have small allocations here, small there, some bonds, whatever. But I can't find anything with these kind of combination of safety, value, growth, and income. And there are three categories of investors. growth, income, and value. And I always joke, that's all I want from one investment, all three. And this is one that I believe has it, but again, no promises. So here's why I really like MPLX. First of all, this is good for U.S. investors. It's a pipeline. It shouldn't be held in an IRA because of tax implications, but it has some real tax advantages in terms of return of principal, depreciation. So it's basically has a very tax efficient return or tax-free return. It has a 7.4% dividend, I believe, as of today. And it has a tremendous history of price appreciation and growth. I mean, year after year, it's been great. You can pull those numbers up yourself. I always like to look at dividend history. I looked at price appreciation. I've owned it as part of my portfolio for years. It's just been great. Here's some of the other things I like about it. First of all, what it does is it transports oil and gas, which is basically necessities. I think a lot of people are driving these days. The roads are packed, and it's mostly oil used to heat homes and drive. And so every time I'm on the road and it's crowded, I think, well, there's a lot of need there. And so there's what's called demand push in terms of there's demand pull, I should say. So basically, people need it, and it's gonna keep flowing. And they have long-term contracts to supply energy around the country, and it's mainly U.S. based, and I'm a mainly U.S. based investor, and that's proven out for years. About 2/3 of their oil, income does come from oil, and the natural gas strategy is not bad either. I'm a little nervous about NGL, but a good part of their natural gas pipes are in the Marcellus and other eastern-based shale formations and gas formations where they're supplying the U.S. with energy in the East. And this, again, with these long-term contracts, the numbers look great. MPLX, and this is one that I just figured out, this is really strong to me. MPLX recent earnings presentation said they gave out about $1 billion in distributions, which gave that 7.5% yield. They said, which, this part I knew, was it was covered by 1.5 times. So theoretically, they could have paid out about 11% or so, 12% with just their cash flow. But what I saw then is they had $1 billion in acquisitions. So theoretically, if they didn't spend the $1 billion in growth, they could have given that to dividend investors too, or used it for safety if the economy tightened up and said, okay, we just won't buy anything for a while. So basically, you might be looking at a really rough estimate of cash flow of about 20% a year, which is pretty safe, supporting a 7.5% dividend, maybe it's 18%, whatever. It's huge cash flows and growth and value. So MPLX, I wish I could find more. I've been looking for years, and that's one I'm going to go with every time for now. But I will, in 2 weeks, as I said, get into a smaller position on Apple, and that might be a good hedge. So now we're into the panel question of the week. We'll bring on Nick. Come on in, Nick, wherever you are. Okay. So the question, as I mentioned, is, and then we'll get into the background and the discussion. What do you think of the recent spat or split, depending on how you want to call it that, between Elon Musk and Donald Trump? Quick background, everybody's seen this story. Anybody who follows the news, obviously. But Elon Musk and Donald Trump had a big falling out, and they had been allied on a lot of things. And the main topic was the big, beautiful bill in Congress. Elon did say that, or wasn't too happy about getting rid of EV mandates, which that's another discussion, but I'm probably in favor of that because let the market do what it wants. But whatever he thought of that, his main thing, or the main thing that you heard a lot, is he warned of, quote, debt slavery. And he was concerned that the bill, and it would, according to the Congressional Budget Office, raise the deficits in the United States. So the Congressional Budget Office, however, going back the other way, there's a lot of questions about their numbers. They're really locked into their methodology, and they have been proven wrong before, including the first Trump tax cuts, where they totally discounted any growth. So their scores don't consider, one, the effective tariffs collections, which could offset a lot of the additional costs. They don't count the fact that the tax cuts are already into the economy. So they're counting that as additional debt or deficit spending when it's already really part of the economy, and it did create growth. It ignores any additional efforts in terms of deregulation. It ignores energy drilling, to bring down the cost of energy, and possible and likely certain onshoring of manufacturing probably isn't considered fully. Again, the CBO is locked in. So there are technical arguments where the CBO arguments is wrong, but on the other side, Elon Musk is making a very good point. This does increase the debt, and the U.S. has a big debt problem. Nick, what's your view?
I agree with Mr. Elon Musk in this particular battle, because the thing is, once again, we're ignoring the national debt. And once again, we're ignoring the deficit, which is annually the increase of the national debt. And this is a very important topic, because as we have shown in David Walker's show, where he's been showing us the light, you'll love this number. Interest on the national debt right now is $892 billion a year. So as David Walker points out, your tax dollars go for what? To pay interest on the debt, which you get nothing. So the fiscal irresponsibility that takes place on the Hill is incredible. It would be nice to see a government come up with a policy that we're going to balance the budget. The last person who did it was Bill Clinton, and he worked very diligently with Newt Gingrich to make sure the budget was balanced. Prior to that, it was actually Richard Nixon who balanced the budget. But since the Clinton era, all we've had is borrow, spend, don't raise taxes, but borrow and spend. And all they need to do, I mean, not all they need to do, but what they really need to seriously consider is to create or recreate some of these taxes and earmark them to reduce the debt. But we see no fiscal responsibility whatsoever in Congress. The word on the Hill that I get, it's a 70% probability the big, beautiful bill will get passed, not in its current format, but close to it. And so the American taxpayer will be screwed once again by the unified parties and the party in charge. And your future will be okay, but your grandchildren's future will not be okay.
So a lot of things you just said are definitely true. But I'll take issue with at least one. But $892 billion, by the way, is more, and a lot of people may know this already, but it's more than the U.S. defense budget already. And it's just the debt is compounding and compounding. You're right, too, about fiscal responsibility. I mean, you have the SALT caucus saying, oh, we should raise the SALT deductions, and everybody's got their own interests. Admittedly, they have political pressures to say, oh, this is why you should reelect me. But on the other side, it doesn't make for doing the right thing. And at some point, the country is going to have to do the right thing, or it's going to be made to do the right thing, but it's going to be harder and harder to do it. So in terms of the balanced budget, I have to take issue with that one point about Clinton, because when he said balance the budget, they never counted, and it wasn't even Clinton's fault in that one case, but they weren't counting the massive Medicare and Social Security unfunded obligations that grew throughout his term and keep growing and growing since the programs were created, more or less. And this is off the books obligations. So we always point out that David Walker, who was former controller of the United States under two presidents, estimates that the real obligations and debt of the United States is $125 trillion in present value. So everybody's scared, 36 trillion, 37 trillion. Why isn't there anybody talking about the 125 trillion? It's like, oops, that's kind of like 3 or 4 times the size. And they're scared about 36. But my conclusions are the following. One, in the end, Elon is right about the fact that the deficits and the debt are a major problem. We've been talking about it, forever because it's going to have huge investment implications. It's already affecting the economy. But the other side is the bill itself is actually a plus. If you took out the tax cuts, which again created growth, there's actually, I believe, about 1 point. It's always changing, but 1.5, 1.7 in real cuts. I mean, we're talking about cutting a lot of waste. This is a first step. It's only a first step. But if the Congress, and I predict it will be the first step, and here's why. So it's a good first step, and Elon just kind of lost it. Maybe because the EV thing too, who knows? But the thing is, I don't know when the government's going to realize, hopefully soon, that this needs to be only the first step because of that massive 125 trillion in real debt and obligations. So it's going to happen sooner than when the funds run out of money in 7 or 8 years and before 10 years. But hopefully the government will be taking a lot of steps each time. So as soon as we finish this, we should be getting right back to it. Where else can we cut? Where else can we cut? Where else can we cut? How can we cut Medicare waste? How can we cut Social Security, waste, and waste in healthcare? And by the way, I wrote a 30-page report that David Walker read and didn't make that many changes, but he didn't officially endorse it. But that report contains a lot, and I sent it to 23 senators. Who knows? I mean, there is a lot more concern in Washington, so maybe somebody paid attention to it, but nobody responded to me, so I'll resend it and re-edit it. But the government is going to be forced to deal with this, and the economy is going to be forced to deal with this. And this could easily, back to investing, affect the next 10 and 20 years of investment and make for a very flat and stagflationary environment for the market. I'm not saying the market will go down, but if the market is flat or goes up 2 or 4%, and by the way, Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, I think it was, or I believe, said predicted 3 to 6% annual returns for the market in the next 10 years, average annually. So it's like, wait a minute, if inflation is 5 and you get 3, you're losing ground. Certainly, you lost ground if you're flat in the market for the last year or 6 months against inflation, whether it's 2 or 3 or 4, wherever you want to call it. So a good first step. It's so far to go, but I think the fiscal situation will force the government to act sooner than later. I hope so, because you can't wait till the tsunami's on us and say, "Oh, look, we have 125 trillion in debt and we never dealt with it." It's a little late. So thanks for watching Wall Street Hackers. Thank Nick. And we'll be on with both shows, 6 and 6:15, roughly on July 1st. Hopefully you'll turn in. And as Kim always says, get healthy and get wealthy. Right. See you soon.
We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.